Trump has won the U.S. presidential election a landslide, with the White House, Senate, and House of Representatives all in Republican hands. The Trump 2.0 era has begun. What impact will this return to power have on China, and what is his ultimate strategy? Hi, I'm Dongshan. Welcome to Dig Into China, where we take a deeper look at China to review insights you rarely find elsewhere. In today's episode, we'll discuss the economic impact of Trump's return to office on China. Let's begin with Trump's stance on China, which is far more confrontational than Biden's. Trump and his team consistently emphasize that China, not Russia, is America's top adversary, insisting that the U.S. should concentrate its efforts on countering China. Trump has even proposed imposing a 60% tariff on Chinese imports and revoke China's most favored nation status. Through his tariff strategy, he aims to fully decouple U.S.-China trade within 4 years. Trump's policy raises two main questions. First, will these policies actually be enacted? No matter how ambitious they sound, without implementation, they are ultimately meaningless. Second, if they are enacted, what impact will they have? Let's first address whether these policies will be implemented. In democratic countries, it's common for politicians to make bold promises during campaigns that they fail to carry out once in office. This is especially true for Trump, who is far from a typical politician and more resembles an outspoken internet personality. He frequently makes outlandish statements, often contradicting himself, which only fuels doubts about his ability to follow through on these policies. Looking back at Trump's first term, his record of fulfilling campaign promises was quite poor. Of the promises he made, he fully delivered on just 24, partially fulfilled 23, and abandoned 55, resulting in an overall completion rate of only 23%. This is notably lower than the average for U.S. presidents. For comparison, Obama's completion rate was 48%, with over 20% of his promises partially fulfilled. In fact, most of Obama's campaign promises were largely accomplished during his presidency. So, does this mean the 60% tariff and the tough stance on China are just campaign slogans? Not exactly. Campaign promises usually fail for two main reasons. The first is subjective. The promises were made to appeal to voters but were never truly intended, so they are abandoned after the election. The second reason is objective. The leader genuinely wants to pursue these policies but encounters significant obstacles. After all, the U.S. president doesn't have the unchecked power of Xi Jinping to enact policies as they please. Reflecting on Trump's first term, his commitment to fulfilling campaign promises wasn't lacking. Trump demonstrated a clear intent to follow through on his pledges. However, many of his promises stalled primarily due to congressional obstacles. Although he won the election, his power in office was limited. Not only did he face resistance from Democrats, but he also encountered pushback from the Republican establishment within his own party, preventing many of his initiatives from advancing. This time around, Trump's position is different. In his 2.0 era, he's not only reclaimed the presidency but also gained control of both chambers of Congress. Over the past 4 years, he's solidified his influence within the Republican Party, with much of the party now firmly supporting him. This internal unity is likely to make it easier for Trump to implement his policies. Reflecting on his first term, we see that his fulfilled promises were mainly in foreign policy and tax reform, while he made less progress on issues like immigration and healthcare. If Trump maintains his first-term governing style, the tariffs on China will likely be implemented swiftly. These won't just be empty promises or campaign slogans. Some hold out hope, however, seeing Trump's businessman mindset as leaving room for negotiation. Key advisor Elon Musk, who has extensive business interests in China, might even serve as a bridge for dialogue between the US and China. I believe that although Trump's businessman mentality could allow for some negotiation, the Chinese Communist Party currently has very limited bargaining power. Firstly, China's current economic situation is challenging. The central government has struggled to implement a viable policy to stimulate the market. So how much bargaining power does it really have with Trump? What Trump wants is for Chinese companies to invest heavily in the US and for China to buy large quantities of American goods. But with China's consumption power in such a state, how can these goods be consumed? Who will buy them? Additionally, given the current unemployment situation in China, if companies choose to build factories in the US rather than China, what will happen to the jobless workers? Even if negotiations happen and Trump is satisfied, it seems that China's economy could still face serious consequences. On the other hand, during the previous US-China trade negotiations, Xi Jinping deceived Trump. Promises like purchasing large amounts of American soybeans were never fulfilled, which will make this round of talks even more difficult. Since the tariffs are likely to be implemented, what will their impact be? I think the effects can be broken down into direct and indirect consequences. Let's start with the direct impact, which is the 60% tariff itself. While this tariff will undoubtedly have a negative effect on China's economy, it's unlikely to lead to a collapse. China's current exports to the US total about $500 billion, or roughly 3.5 trillion yuan per year, making up around 15% of China's total exports. This share is relatively low and even less than that of Southeast Asia. While it's still uncertain how much this tariff would reduce China's exports to the US, earlier estimates from UBS suggest that a 60% tariff could lower China's GDP growth rate by 2.5%. This means that if the tariff were implemented in 2025, China's GDP growth could plummet to around 2%. In addition, the tariff could lead to a significant depreciation of the yuan. According to Nomura Securities, the yuan might weaken to around 8.3 against the dollar, bringing it back to levels seen in the 1990s. One important factor to consider is whether the reported decline in China's exports to the US, now only 15% of total export, is accurate. This is because we don't know how many Chinese products are being rerouted through countries like Vietnam or Mexico before reaching the US. If a large portion of China's exports are being redirected through these countries, the impact of US tariffs on China could be more significant. Trump's plan doesn't allow for manufacturing being relocated to other countries before being exported to the US. His strategy offers two options. Either China stops exporting to the US or moves manufacturing back to the US. As a result, products originally made in China but rerouted through Vietnam or Mexico, or those produced by Chinese companies in these countries, would still face tariffs. Some may wonder how the tariffs will be applied and how products will be identified as made in China. In Trump's approach, there is no need to determine the origin of every product. His reasoning is straightforward. Any country with a large trade surplus with the US, that is, countries that export to the US without significant imports from it, will face higher tariffs. As China's products are rerouted through other countries, those countries will see their trade surplus with the US rise, making it inevitable that the redirected products will be subject to high tariffs. Additionally, this could lead those countries to start rejecting Chinese products that are being rerouted to avoid tariffs. In my opinion, even if products rerouted through other countries are subject to high tariffs, the 60% tariff on China will still have a limited impact and won't bring China to its knees. The real concern, however, lies in the fact that Trump's influence extends far beyond these tariffs. If Trump were the president of a smaller country like Argentina, we wouldn't have to worry about additional indirect consequences. But Trump is the US president, and every action he takes has the potential to shape global events. His policies don't just affect the US, they trigger broader worldwide repercussions. What exactly is this global impact? Before delving into that, it's important to first understand the core of Trump's governance. In discussions about Trump alongside the familiar slogan, "Make America Great Again," we often hear two other terms, America First and the isolationism it fosters. These concepts reflect Trump's distinct version of America's place in the world. Prior to Trump, the world functioned within a global system shaped by the United States, or more precisely, by the post-Cold War order established by America. There are many terms to describe this system, but the US viewed itself as its founder, protector, and most importantly, its leader. Biden's policies clearly reflect this approach. Although he opposes the Chinese Communist Party, his opposition is rooted within the framework of globalization. Biden perceives the CCP as undermining the global trade system. Consequently, his strategy focuses on supporting allies, building alliances, and promoting multilateralism. This includes strengthening the G7, establishing the Indo-Pacific framework, and shifting manufacturing away from China, among other initiatives. Biden's approach to China, apart from its focus on high-tech sectors, mainly targets the new three sectors. The rationale behind these sanctions is that China's subsidies to these companies, which boost their competitiveness, undermine the principles of fair, free trade. In general, the Biden administration's strategy towards China is rooted in strengthening the globalized system without undermining it, and seeks to reinforce the broader framework of globalization. However, Trump fundamentally rejects this approach. As an outspoken critic of globalization, he argues that it has hurt the United States, with China being the main culprit. To Trump, China is the clear adversary, with its cheap labor taking American jobs and contributing to the struggles of working-class Americans. When it comes to allies, his America First stance means the US no longer acts as a global leader, but rather as a transactional power focused on selling arms, products, and technology. Trump's core logic leads to two key international trends: the compulsion to take sides and the growing spread of anti-globalization. The first issue is the pressure to choose sides. Biden, advocating for free trade and positioning himself as a leader of a global trade alliance, has avoided directly isolating China from the global trade system, allowing countries like the EU members to continue trading with China. However, Trump's stance is quite different. Once in power, he would compel many nations to make a clear choice between aligning with China or the US. One of Trump's key advisors, Robert Lighthizer, who served as a U.S. trade representative during Trump's first term, has been invited back for the next one. In an October interview with the New York Times, Lighthizer elaborated on a more aggressive economic strategy toward China. His plan calls for Trump to implement a 60% tariff on China right away and add all Chinese high-tech companies to the SDN list, a move that would exert direct pressure on China. Let me clarify what it means to be placed on the SDN list. The SDN, Specially Designated Nationals list, is considered a nuclear option for sanctions, and it differs from the current restrictions on Huawei. Entities or individuals placed on this list are not only prohibited from doing business in the US, but also banned from conducting any transactions, services, or research activities involving the US. While this may seem similar to the sanctions on Huawei, the SDN sanctions have a more far-reaching impact, including secondary sanctions that can extend to other countries and entities. What does secondary sanctions mean? For example, current sanctions on Huawei mainly prevent it from using TSMC chips, selling products in the US, and restrict American companies from using Huawei equipment like a base station. However, if Huawei were added to the SDN list, countries using Huawei's equipment, such as base stations, would also be subject to US sanctions due to their reliance on Huawei for network services or financial transactions linked to the US. If this happens, countries in Europe and Latin America would be forced to make a choice, no longer able to navigate between the US and China as they did under Biden's administration. At present, there are approximately 12,000 entities on the US SDN list, with only around 400 of them being Chinese, mostly individuals involved in implementing the national security law and only a handful of companies. However, according to Lighthizer plan, the Trump 2.0 era will be different, and companies such as Huawei are likely to be added to the list. Another global impact of Trump's presidency is whether the wave of anti-globalization will expand. Based on exit polls from the Associated Press during this election, the main concerns of Americans are the economy and immigration, both of which are deeply connected to globalization. Harris supporters are mostly found in coastal regions and major cities, while Trump's base is concentrated in inland areas and rural communities. The root cause of this divide, in my opinion, lies in the fact that globalization has created distinct groups of winners and losers. Globalization has not only facilitated free trade, but also established a global division of labor. In developed countries, individuals with higher education focus on creativity and innovation, while in developing countries where labor costs are lower, manufacturing and production are the primary tasks. Since innovation and creativity are more complex and demanding, those in these areas typically receive a larger share of the wealth generated by globalization. On the other hand, those engaged in manufacturing and production, which require less skill and are easier to perform, tend to capture a smaller portion of the wealth. This has been the prevailing trend over the past 3 decades. However, not everyone in developed countries benefits equally. In the context of globalization, white-collar workers in the US, like those at Google or Apple, have largely gained from it. Their innovations and designs are made into products at a lower cost by utilizing cheaper labor in developing countries. This process enables them to sell more products at a competitive price, amplifying their profits and expanding their reach. However, not everyone in a country is involved in innovation or design. What happens to those who are only engaged in manufacturing? They can't compete with cheaper labor from the developing world. These individuals become the casualties of globalization in developed nations. Furthermore, immigrants from the developing world, often a byproduct of globalization, compete with them for jobs. The division in the US is somewhat similar to China's experience with globalization. China's coastal cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen have flourished, with regions like Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Shanghai benefiting the most. In contrast, people in the central and western provinces have been left behind. The key difference is that in China, citizens don't have the power to vote, so they remain passive victims of this divide. In the US, however, people can vote, and Trump has positioned himself as the voice of those left behind in this globalized system. Trump's strategy extends beyond just imposing tariffs on China. He advocates for a 10% tariff on all countries, with China facing the highest burden. Essentially, Trump embodies a shift towards anti-globalization. He and his supporters believe that by leveraging tariffs, they can reverse the course of globalization, promoting deglobalization to improve their own economic prospects. Is the push for deglobalization an attitude exclusive to the United States, or is it a broader global trend? The victims of globalization are not limited to the US. Countries like Canada, Australia, and the members of the EU have been impacted as well. In fact, nearly all developed nations have felt the effects. Therefore, if Trump's anti-globalization strategies succeed in boosting the US economy, it could spark a worldwide shift towards deglobalization, with more nations adopting similar isolationist policies. At present, there are 2 potential outcomes for the Trump 2.0 era. One is that Trump's approach fails entirely and the deglobalization results not in economic growth but in economic collapse. The forced alignment of countries may not make them choose the US. Instead, it could lead to growing resentment, causing many nations to gravitate towards China. In this case, the 60% tariff on on China might lose its effectiveness and its overall impact could ultimately be negligible. With the US pursuing high tariffs, isolationism, and forcing countries to choose sides, many nations may begin to reject or limit trade with the US. In response, China, the European Union, East Asia, and Latin America could establish their own global trade system, forming a new free trade alliance that sidelines the US from the global economic framework. Another possible outcome is that Trump's 2.0 era could succeed fully. He might force countries to choose sides and they could ultimately opt to align with the US. If Trump's isolationist America First policies bring about further economic growth for the US, the consequences for China would go beyond just 2.5% GDP drop due to 60% tariffs. This wouldn't be because the US would grow stronger and directly hurt China, but because the success of isolationist economic policies would inspire other nations. As a result, many countries might start their own deglobalization process and join the US in its isolationist path. In such a scenario, companies on the SDN list may find their products rejected not only by the US but also by the EU, Latin America, and East Asia, leaving only countries like Russia and Iran as potential buyers. Meanwhile, tariffs would not be confined to the US 60% on China. The EU could impose similar tariffs, as could Japan and South Korea, with Latin American countries potentially applying a lower rate of around 40%. In this scenario, the global free trade system would likely disintegrate or fragment into smaller blocks operating separately. This would undermine the core of China's development. China's success has been largely driven by its entry into the WTO, which has been a crucial factor in its economic ascent. Although China has often criticized globalization, accusing the US of exploiting it, China itself has been one of the globalization's greatest beneficiaries. Currently, China accounts for nearly 30% of the global trade surplus, a trend that has been further boosted by Xi Jinping's export-driven policies. The reason China has been able to stay afloat in recent years despite its challenges is largely due to the surge in exports. Without this boost, China's economy would have already faced a significant downturn. The biggest threat Trump poses to China isn't the 60% tariff, but his anti-globalization economic strategy and the pressure to force countries to take sides. If this strategy succeeds, it could undermine the core of China's development. Thank you so much for watching. If you find this video helpful, please like it, drop a comment below, and hit the subscribe button right here. It really helps YouTube suggest my video to others. I'll be back with more content soon. Until then, be well.